Hi, in this short video, we're just going to quickly go through the animation principle of slow in and slow out in Adobe After Effects. The principle behind slow in and slow out is that we create our animation so that it follows more the rules of our physical world. Say, for example, we have the simple animation of a box through space. Um, right now, if I select this, we see that it is this layer here called Box AI, and I just have the scale node open at the moment. I'll just hide that, and I will press P on the keyboard. So I'm going to be setting up some very simple animation. I'm turning on the stopwatch where I want my animation to begin. So let's say that for me, it is exactly at the 2-second mark. I'm turning on the stopwatch. We see here a keyframe has been created, and we see this keyframe here in the timeline for this composition. Let's say that in 1 second's time, this box is going to go from one side of the screen to the other. So there's several ways I can do that. First, I can just drag it. If I also add the modifier key of the shift key, it will constrain it to a straight line. Or another way I could do it is that as long as my time indicator is at a different frame, I can get the X value and just click and drag. And that too will guarantee that I have a reasonably straight transition from point 1 to point 2. If I just use my preview shortcut keys, B to set the beginning of my preview area, and N to set the end of my preview area. If I play that back by pressing the space bar, we see there we have very linear motion. And that's nothing that we see in the real world. So instead, let's look at those options of creating something that eases in and also eases out. And those are the After Effects phrases of slow in, slow out. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is that I'm going to go up to Edit and choose Duplicate. And what that will do is it'll give me a new copy of this layer. So if I go Duplicate, there is another layer called Box AI. If I press the U key on the keyboard, we see that it also copies the keyframes as well. So I have two of the same thing. What I will do is I'm going to go back to this exact keyframe. Now, the way that I can do that is by clicking on this navigator item here. So I've gone exactly to that beginning keyframe, and we see that we get this keyframe icon that turns a shade of blue for us. Instead of changing the X value, I'm now going to change the Y value so that we're stacked one cube on top of another box, not cube. And I'm coming along to the next keyframe, so I could use this button here. And as you can see, that helps me snap between one keyframe and the next. Or I could use the K key on the keyboard. So K goes forward to the next keyframe. J goes back to the previous keyframe. So snapping forward, and I'm going to get that Y value and raise it up again. Now, if I wanted exactly the same movement, let's say that we'll just type in the number 700 here. Let's make that 600. There we go. And I'm going to go forward, and I'm typing in 600 here as well. And again, I have that straight transition. Okay, now for slow in and slow out, or easing in and easing out, we need to go from our normal timeline view to what we see in the graph editor. So if I click on this, we're now going from a view of keyframes and how they are placed in time, and instead what we're looking at is the relationship, the spatial and the time-related relationships between our keyframes. Now, just to make sure that it always appears, if I click on this little switch here, and we see that we have our related graph for this position. Now, what I'm looking at here at the moment is this thing called the speed graph. I'm not going to deal with that at the moment. Instead, we're going to look at the value graph. And we see here that we have a very straight line going from one point to the other. What this is telling me is that this is what we call linear motion, that we are traveling at a constant speed from one keyframe to the other. To ease in, the easiest way to do it is to select the first keyframe and to use ease out or ease in. In this case, since there is no keyframe beforehand, if I select this and click on ease out, what it means is that out from this point, we're going to ease into the speed here about the middle of our animation. Now, if I just scroll through, you see that there is a difference, that the second animation, the one that we've just duplicated, is now traveling initially slower. So let's see that playing back. And so, like all locomotive things in the real world, cars, people, tortoises, horses, we all start off slowly, they all start off slowly, and eventually pick up speed to their maximum momentum. The same thing usually happens at the end of a keyframe sequence as well, in that instead of something just stopping abruptly, unless it is colliding with something, it normally eases into its last keyframe. The process of doing that is very similar. If I select the last keyframe and I'm going to choose ease in. As soon as I click on that, we see that our curve gets to be softened up. So if I zoom up on this, there we go. We see that only about here in the middle quarter do we have a constant speed. Now, leading out from the first keyframe, we are traveling rather slow. As the curve increases, we see a pickup of speed until we reach the maximum speed here, and then we start to slow down at the end. So let's see that playing back. So those are the After Effects automatic settings. I'm going to get Box AI and duplicate it once again. This time, instead of going up to the menu, I'm going to use the shortcut of Command and D. Once again, if I press U on the keyboard, we see my keyframes. I'll just leave this view for the meantime. And I'm going to get this value. Let's go back to our first keyframe. And let's lift that up to about 400. Let's make that 300. Let's go forward to our next keyframe. And again, 300. You will notice here on the timeline that the appearance of our icons have changed. When you have a keyframe that has no easing applied to it, it is just linear animation, it appears as a diamond. When we ease out from a keyframe, we see that there is a small chip taken out on the right-hand side. And then over here, when we are easing in to our final keyframe, you will see that again there is that negative space. So it looks like some of the diamond has intersected into itself. With this third option, what I'm going to do, let's make sure that I'll just hide this layer for the meantime. So making sure that I am looking at the right curve. If I select this curve, I should be able to, with my pen tool, be able to adjust the values of these curves by altering the handles of those curves with the Convert Vertex tool. You'll notice though that when I bring my pen tool close enough, I can certainly click to add a keyframe. Let's undo that. But I can't grab these keyframes to reveal their curve handles, their Bezier handles, to adjust those. The reason why that is that at the moment, the parameters for our animation, both X and Y, are occupying the same transform node. What I need to do is I need to separate these out into two different values, and then I'll be able to adjust the curves. Even if I do that, if I select both, I still can't change the handles. I need to separate these values out. There's two ways to do that. One, I could right mouse click and choose separate dimensions, or I could select this transform node here, the position one, and I can click on this button here, separate dimensions. What it does allow, and this is the significant thing, is that I can now select these keyframes and I can adjust the handles. So that means if I pull this one out straight and I pull this out, I can exaggerate that easing in and easing out behavior. If I turn on motion blur for this layer, let's go to our switches. Let's click on this and this one and turn on the master switch. We see that the amount of motion blur is different, even though both these layers have easing on them. I'll just turn that master off and let's have a preview. Great. So the process of easing in, easing out, or slow in, slow out, shouldn't just be applied to things moving across the screen. It's important to apply this in all aspects of your animation in After Effects. So, say for example, over here, if I use the type tool and I type the word introducing. Now, with this word, I'm just going to make sure that I have a good contrasting color, and that I might even get the point size to be somewhat larger. And I'll keep with Helvetica bold. So for a word like this, I could be deciding to have it fade in and fade out. To do that, I'm going to select the text. I just want my text to start here. And I'm pressing the T key on the keyboard to open up opacity. What I'm going to do is I set my first keyframe where I want that to be 0 opacity, so it's totally invisible, in about half a second. It's going to fade up, then it's going to remain on the screen for somewhat over a second, almost a second and a half. I'm adding another keyframe, and I'm having that once again at 100%. So between here and here, there's no animation. I could do the same thing by toggling a hold keyframe, but I'll discuss them at another time. Finally, I'm going to add a fourth keyframe and returning it to 0. So if I just play this back, B to set the beginning, N to set your preview end, there is my loop. In a situation like this, I would still apply the idea of easing in and easing out. If I come to my graph for opacity, there it is there. If I select these and I click on the auto zoom graph height, let's just come to here. Auto zoom isn't wanting to work for me. I think that is because inside here I have those turned on. Let's check my other layers. No, that's all fine. And that's all fine. Okay, and we see now that that is jumping to the full height of my timeline. So that means now I can select my keyframes and I can choose with my Convert Vertex tool, decide the acceleration and deacceleration for that curve. Let's do the same thing on the other side. There we go. So now when I play it back, the fade in and fade out have a bit more snap to them. I could equally have decided to just click using my selection tool, click and drag a marquee, a selection around all of those keyframes, and used the easy ease. But I think I'm actually happy with my first attempt, where I set the curve handles myself. Okay, moving on to one further example. So, instead of text fading in and out, let's say I will hide this for the time being. If you have something in your composition you don't want to see, or you're not too sure if you want to keep it, the eye icon will make that layer invisible, just like you would expect in Photoshop. Okay, something we haven't seen before, but another good place to use easing. In fact, every place is a good place to use easing. I'm using the Ellipse Tool. I'm making sure I have nothing selected, and I've chosen a white stroke, and as you can see, I'm not using a fill. I've selected the fill option and gone with this first option, which means no fill. I have my stroke. As you can see, it has a reasonably thick appearance to it. And what I'm going to do with that is that I'm coming to the shape layer box and I'm looking inside the contents. So if I open up Ellipse, we see next to the contents further along there's this thing called Add. And that means that I can add new parameters or transform nodes to this object and then be able to further animate those. And that's what I'm going to do here. Clicking on Add, I'm choosing Trim Paths, this option here. And what Trim Path does, we see here, it has been added. If I open up its options, we see that we have this thing called Start and End. And again, we have animation switches that we can turn on. Coming back to here. If I just experiment with these, we'll see that as soon as I change the start value, that the beginning of the path, the beginning of the circle, appears to be drawing itself on or off. And that's what trim path allows me to do, to decide whether at the beginning or at the end, how far, and both, how much of this path are we going to show. You'll see also that there is an offset value, which allows me to take a section of the path and then be able to twist that around the whole shape. I'll just set that back to 0. So, starting off at 0%, and I'm going to get the end and set that to 0 as well. So thinking along the lines of an animated infographic, I'm going to turn on end value. So I've got my first keyframe of it being the value 0. And then after a short amount of time, I'm going to wind that up to 100%. Now, let's turn on the switch so that it appears in our graph editor. And if I go to the graph editor, we see that there's our linear animation from no circle to full circle. So let's see that play. Okay, that's pretty fast. Let's go back and I get this and I'll drag it out. I'll change the timing slightly. Let's see that again. Okay, superb. But again, it's really quite flat, lifeless animation. We might want it to actually slow down before it gets to the end, before it completes itself. To do that, let's go to the graph editor. And here, I'm going to get the Convert Vertex tool. And I drag out a handle like this. What this means is that as time progresses, especially when we get to here, the amount of change getting from 75 to 80% to 100% becomes slower as we progress through. Let's have a look at that. And there we go. It eases into the end. I could pull that out a bit further. Now we notice that it is really abrupt here. The way that we can mediate that is by going back to our keyframe. And I'll just drag out a touch more time. I could also decide to incorporate maybe somewhat of a fast, incorporate somewhat of a slow in as well. Let's balance that up a little bit. And that looks great. Okay, so we've seen 3 examples of the uses of ease in and ease out. We've seen it through the movement of a shape. I'll just tuck that along here for the meantime, because up here we've also seen it in the fading in and out of text. Now, let's get that all happening a little bit further along. There we go. I'll get this and I'll come to my position and I'll just move that across, because we see that if I bring the two together, there we go. Let's play that out. So the two work rather nicely together. And then initially, we looked at slow in and out through the movement of one object with the same keyframes, just with different easing relationships. So you see that they are all in the same beginning position and the same end position. To quickly sum things up for us, if we have a straight line in our graph editor, it means that we have constant motion. If we have a curve like this, it means that we are starting out slowly and accelerating into something. The more vertical your line, the faster you're traveling. And the same goes here in the opposite. As the line flattens out, the slower our animation becomes. If we look at our final version, there it is. We should see also that we can, through the use of our Convert Vertex tool, we can also further alter the lead in and lead out times of our animations. Okay, that's it for slow in and slow out. See you next time.